we'll get going. So just Mary Bonnet and myself, we are both the Sustainable Ag Facilitators here in the ACT. We're funded through the Climate Ag Smart Program, Department of Forestry and Fisheries, DAF, and we also help to deliver some of the other programs that ACT and NRM have, like the Future Drought Fund, Farm Business Resilience Program, which is what's funding our webinar series, our Farming in the Changing Climate webinar series with Andrew Ward. So we really thank the Commonwealth Government for their contribution from the Future Drought Fund. We've been running this program since 2021, and we've been able to do a series of webinars, training exercises, workshops, forums, and all sorts of things for our ACT and New South Wales community. So it's been an absolutely amazing project, and we're in co-designing, hopefully, funding for the next few years in the next program as well. So I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the ACT, which is where I'm working from today, and recognise any other people or families with connections to the lands of the ACT and region. I obviously acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and contribution they make to this amazing city and our life. So I actually think that's probably enough from me. I'll give you all a reminder of our upcoming webinars at the end. But if Wardy, you're ready, I'm happy for you to take over, share screen, and start your presentation.
Will certainly do. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Mary. Hello, everybody. I'm normally based on Awabakal country, which is between Sydney and Newcastle, but today I find myself in Kintaro country, between Ingham and Townsville in far north Queensland. Other people call this Katter country. In fact, it might be more famous as Katter country than Kintaro country, given his reputation. So I'm going to share a presentation with you today, and the idea is that halfway through, when we've covered the market mechanisms, I'd like to stop and invite you to ask some questions if you have any, and then at the end make available further questions. So was really excited when Mary and Jenny got in touch to say, can you do similar to what we did as a webinar 4 years ago, the Demystifying Environmental Markets 2025 edition. And it caused me to think about, well, where were we 4 years ago and what's changed and what's become different in those 4 years. And so that's really shaped the agenda in today's presentation. But 4 years ago, I think there was, at least on the east coast of Australia, we'd come out of years of drought into quite significant flooding and bushfires. And the idea of carbon markets was particularly loud in the media. And I think most farmers, individually and collectively, just wanted to put their head in the sand, hoping that a lot of this would just go away. They found 4 years ago, and they, are correct still today, that this whole environmental market space is just loaded full of jargon and acronyms. And I work in this space full time, and I find it difficult to keep up with all of the acronyms. So for farmers whose real job is like producing food and fiber, being hands-on, being practical, to deal with a lot of the environmental and climate and sustainability pressures that are coming onto farmers is really difficult. After we first did this demystifying environmental markets, there are a couple of things that remain the same, which are unfortunate. The first of those is that the government was unhelpful in 2021 when they were calling the ERF, the Emissions Reduction Fund, and the Clean Energy Regulator schemes a market, because they were the 96% of the volume purchaser. And so there was no reason for the private market to participate in carbon projects. The government was filling the role of regulator and buyer, wearing two hats. And this was unhelpful in terms of market dynamics because it didn't allow private companies, they sort of crowded out private companies, if you want. The challenge today is that government is unhelpful for different reasons. In 2022, the then Taylor government, Angus Taylor, who was the energy minister, backed out of all the 96% of volume of contracts that they were engaged with and said, no, we have to let the private market enter. And that moved the price from about $60 a tonne of carbon dioxide down to around $30. And today it's still around $35. But in that process of time, there was lots of criticisms of the clean energy regulator and the different methods, particularly the HIR method, the human-induced regeneration method, which is a huge carbon pool. And various scientists have continued to show that it doesn't lead to the abatement that it claims. And they had an integrity inquiry into that, and the integrity inquiry basically said there's nothing to see here. And I don't think that is true. And so the government has become unhelpful because it's held sham integrity inquiries. It's been unhelpful because it's had methodologies which 10 years after their implementation expire, and then they haven't had, in the case of planting trees, they knew for 10 years when the method would expire. But there was a 6-month gap there where farmers couldn't be rewarded because they couldn't get into a method in order to even plant trees, which is, you know, one of the most basic things that sequesters carbon. The other thing that was present in 2024 and is still 2021 and is still 4 years later is that metrics around natural capital or biodiversity and what that means outside of a ton of carbon dioxide are still emergent. It's still true 4 years ago and today that a group of individuals, landowners, are better off than individual landowners because collectively you get scale. And it's still true that if we now have to account not just for the food and fibre that we produce as farmers, but also for the environmental and climate impact that the production of food and fibre has, that food and fibre prices must increase to cover the costs of factoring in climate and environment. And no government wants to see the price of food increase. And that is a problem, because if we take this seriously and we want to include environment and climate in the cost of food and fibre, it's going to set off inflation. And inflation is something that governments don't get re-elected on. And if we don't take climate and environment seriously, whether it's fires happening in California in the middle of winter, unseasonal cyclones in Brisbane, it's a race to the end. And the reality of this is still the same as it was 4 years ago. Farmers cop a lot of poor public relations for their impact on climate, and particularly ruminant animals are suffering. You know, the metrics look like a 500-kilo cow produces 3 times its body weight in carbon dioxide equivalent every year. And it looks like if you feed it 20 mils of seaweed, suddenly it only produces 200 kilos, not 1.5 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And so you end up with very confusing messages about what's natural and what's a cyclical function versus what the international world views as greenhouse warming potential. And the reality is that farmers are the only ones, but everybody in the economy, you know, as consumers, as people that transport stuff, as people that like to keep our houses warm, our electricity and internet connected, that we all consume, combust, extract and pollute. But only farmers through photosynthesis and land stewardship can take carbon out of the atmosphere and turn it into, well, habitat for wildlife, healthy soils, food and fiber that we all need every day. And so really farmers, instead of being criticised, should be seen as the white knights of climate and environment action, because we can do something useful as members of society to positively affect climate and environment, and everybody else is just a consumer and an extractor with an opinion. Farmers actually have all the aces. And the way that farmers view the world is that, you know, the first priority for them is production, but then it's about hydrology. Keeping water in the landscape and water utilization enables them to have better production, and water enables life, biodiversity, which is probably the third order priority. And then way down there is carbon on a farmer's, you know, traditional, like typical hierarchy of needs. But the market, it views carbon as the first thing that it could put a metric around with tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And then it's getting to the point where it understands biodiversity better, but it really hasn't started to understand how to reward hydrology, landscape rehydration, reduction in sediment, reduction in water pollution, etc. And so where the market is mature and where the market has an interest and where the farmers are interested is not well aligned. And you've got to remember that individually and collectively, there's about 40% of Australia's land mass that's traditional owners. There's another 10%, which is federal lands, state lands, local government lands. But half of Australia is owned by private landholders, of which the majority are farmers trying to produce food and fibre. And so when somebody sits in Melbourne or Sydney or even Townsville, where I'm heading later, and says, well, you know, I really care about the environment or furry animals or climate change, they need to be empowering the ones with land, the farmers, in order to be able to make an effect on climate and environment. Changing the light bulb, recycling is really a piss in the ocean. So what's new in the last 4 years in terms of markets that we should be discussing? And so I want to take you through offsets, insets, landscapes and supply sheds, biodiversity mechanisms and traceability. And then I'll pull up there and we can have some discussions before the second half of today's conversation. So let's talk about an offset. An offset is powered by a government mechanism. It's targeted at the top polluters in Australia. So this tends to be your coal, oil and gas, heavy manufacturing around cement and steel. And these large emitters, they've been told, okay, you've got a baseline, and from that baseline until 2030, you need to be reducing the emissions that you put out into the atmosphere by 5% every year on your baseline. And if you can't do that, because ultimately what you're doing is digging up hydrocarbons and combusting them for energy, you need to go and find typically farmers who have sequestered carbon, typically in soils, trees, or through avoided emissions, and purchase offsets that those farmers have created in order to make your balance continue to reduce 5% year on year. The effect of that is that we're seeing more and more of these safeguard mechanism buyers entering into the market since 2021, where the safeguard buyers were, at about equivalent to the amount of proponents in the market, to the end of 2024, where the number of proponents in the market was maybe only a third of the volume seeking a home. As you project out 2025 towards 2030, you will see a continued gap between supply of offsets and demand for offsets. And that gap is worsened by the fact that if you're going to invest in high integrity on offsets, things that you can see like trees or soil carbon project, where you directly measure soil carbon in 1 year and then 3 to 5 years later directly measure it again, and you can see the increase in permanent, what they call stable carbon, that those methods have, if you started them today, they don't actually generate the offsets until the tree grows to 2 meters tall and 20% crowning at a minimum. And that usually takes up to 5 years. So as you've got limited supply, increasing demand, and the ability for farmers to produce high integrity credits takes 5 years or thereabouts, if you started today, you're going to see a gap in the market for offsets. And doing a carbon project, it's a difficult thing to do. The discovery process takes about 9 months, 6 to 9 months to do. And then the registration and payback for a farmer is a 25-year decision. And naturally, farmers are not wanting to rush into 25-year decisions in the face of so much jargon, uncertainty, and, a lot of them feel quite rightly aggrieved at being pointed to as the baddies in environment and climate, when actually they're the only ones in the economy doing anything productive. And carbon prices, despite this systemic supply and demand difference and the gap in when you start a project to when they start to yield, are still very flat. Just to point this out, this is the point in December 2021, January 2022, where 96% of the market, represented by the government, said, well, we're out of the market. And at that point, it dropped to $30. And today it's $35 per tonne. So there's not much of an economic incentive to have farmers pull land out of food and fibre production to help coal, oil and gas people offset their emissions really cheaply, when for the farmer it's a 25-year project and has huge amounts of costs, risks and energy and effort associated with it. Carbon, as we've mentioned, is the top priority for people, and there seems to be almost a tunnel vision, a myopia around carbon, as it's come to represent, a way that everybody can contribute to reductions in climate change. But carbon, we don't know the effects of increasing carbon, but we know the effects of biodiversity loss. No bees equals no breakfast. No breakfast equals no humans. It's far more important to make sure our small water cycle, our biodiversity and habitat, our pollinators, our ability to continue to produce is looked at, not just carbon emissions. And then there's the valuation. So we've already talked about offsets being set at around $35 a tonne, and that's what the coal, oil and gas guys would be paying at the moment for a tonne of carbon dioxide. Whereas the insets market, which I'm just about to, take you through, they're not willing to pay more than $3 a tonne for carbon dioxide equivalent that's inset. And so already, without the prices of offsets taking off, the food supply system is not willing to reward farmers anywhere near the same level as the pollution, business as usual, carbon into the atmosphere industry is willing to pay. And in fact, in food systems, there's really an existential argument, and you see this with Trump, that there are people that are like, they don't want the environment priced at all. It's the drill, baby, drill. We recognize that 73% of emissions come from energy, and that we really are an energy economy. And then there's the world, particularly dominated by Europe and Asia, that want to price the environment into everything. And they come together, these international things like Paris and Montreal and Copenhagen and Glasgow, and they make, grand statements about limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees or no further extinctions. And from these government set targets, they create things like science-based targets for nature, the Task Force for Climate-related Financial Disclosures, the Task Force for Nature-related Disclosures. And then those inform internationally what accounting standards need to report, or financial reporting of, fundability of projects need to report, or even things as simple as what an ISO, so your International Standards Organization, would typically attest to the quality of production of a heater or a toaster or an appliance, but they are also attesting to the quality of food and fiber with respect to climate and environment. And this means that farmers need to provide claims and consumers need to buy claims that are consistent with the standards, the multilateral kind of organization frameworks, and the government set targets. And you're seeing Europe and Asia on the right side of this, right-hand side, not necessarily the right is incorrect. And you see the US more than ever on the left-hand side of this, with energy is essential, climate and environment can wait. We need to drill, baby, drill, and increase our energy independence. And so let's talk to the half of the world that is interested in what does it mean to account for climate and environment. And in Australia, well, all over the world, it's asking the farmers to reduce their carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. And industry are totally invested in this, whether it's the MLAs, 70% reduction by 2030, carbon neutral by 2050, whether it's the supply chains, McDonald's saying they're going to have deforestation free, carbon neutral by 2035, or whether it's the banks whose lending book is the aggregate of all of the people that they lend to and the emissions intensity of those lending. They're all looking for their lending book to be reduced over time, and therefore the farmers need to be the ones to reduce their emissions, because it's the farmers' emissions that add up to their emissions. And let's not forget that in legislation, not just a goal, is a 43% reduction in Australia by 2030 and a commitment to net zero by 2050. How you transition an economy like Australia, where we still are so heavily reliant on, ruminant animals for protein, on coal fire energy, coal, oil, gas, to get to net zero, to run our buses, our tractors, our infrastructure. It's quite mind-boggling. But the only people in the economy, as we've said at the beginning of this presentation, are farmers using photosynthesis that can take atmospheric carbon and turn it into useful stuff. So literally all eyes are on the farmer. And you know, the biggest change to accounting since, you know, double entry bookkeeping is coming in. In fact, it came in several months ago into Australia through our accounting standards. And these are called the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards. And over here you can see that there are organisations grouped by size. Group 1 refers to the billion-dollar companies, your ASX listed companies. Group 2 refers to your medium-sized businesses, 500 million to a billion in revenue. And group 3 are your organizations like your typical farm where you're sub 50 million, you're certainly not 500 million. And you can see that over time, all three groups need to get to the point where they're doing full reporting by 2030. And when I say full reporting, at the moment, as in 3 months ago, every billion-dollar company, ASX listed company in Australia needs to report, and the directors of these companies are fiduciarily responsible, not just for their profit and loss and their balance sheet, but also for the accuracy of their scope 1 and 2 emissions and for their 2-degree plan. Now, it's currently scheduled as legislation that in January 2026, those same companies become responsible not just for scope 1 and 2, but for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Now, I should have put a slide in here, but for those that don't know what I'm talking about with scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, if you're McDonald's, your scope 1 emissions are the lights that you turn on, the energy to run your franchise, the energy that it takes to get a 16-year-old to flip burgers, right? Your scope 2 emissions are the transport that's associated with bringing the fries and the burgers and the buns into that franchise that sells McDonald's burgers. Your scope 3 emissions are the emissions that come from your ingredients. So that's the emissions from the sugar that goes into the Coke, or the flour that goes into the bun, or the beef that goes into the patty. And clearly for organizations, your scope 1 and 2 are maybe single digits, maybe 10% of your total emissions report and total emissions impact. By far and away, the majority of the emissions for those big companies come from the ingredients that they source, which must come from the food and fiber that's produced by farmers. And so because these companies are legally responsible to report on this stuff 3 years or more before the farmers are, they're in a rush to understand, what's my baseline? What am I going to do in my supply chain to reduce my scope 3 emissions? And they face the same gap. They need to be reducing their emissions. But if you're planting a tree or doing soil carbon or doing something that sequesters carbon out of the atmosphere and puts it somewhere useful, that takes time. And more importantly, or as importantly, the supply chains have an appetite to pay you $3 to reduce that carbon out of the atmosphere and put it somewhere useful. Whereas the coal, oil and gas, they're prepared to pay you $30 to do that exact same ton of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so for farmers, the question becomes, well, how much easier is it for me to do my food and fiber production and get the $3 or take a hit on $3 compared to, you know, going into a regulated ACCU market in order to get $30. And so it becomes difficult. Overall, the thing to remember is that before 2025, you could grow a ton of wheat or wool or beef or sugarcane, and you'd sell a ton of wheat or wool or beef or sugarcane, and you'd get paid for that ton. But coming forward, you'll sell that ton but you will probably either be rewarded or penalized in the way that your emissions have accrued, not just for you as a primary producer, but because you're the scope 3 of the banks, you're the scope 3 of the abattoir, you're the scope 3 of the processor, you're the scope 3 of McDonald's, you're the scope 3 of every consumer that eats and shits and wears clothes. And so based on how you've impacted climate and environment, you'll then get paid. And that's a different world, but it's not 100% unfamiliar to farmers. If you're an organic farmer, you've been paid on how you produce, not what you produce. If you're direct consumer selling a story about how your livestock are low stress and how your land management is low impact and you're protecting these beautiful furry creatures, then you're used to consumers paying you for how you produce, not just what you produce. And we've seen this in our supermarket shelves. The difference between barn laid and free range eggs is, more than 2 times the cost. And so reflecting prices for environment, for animal welfare, for society and governance, it's been done before, but this is going to be done at a scale that's unprecedented. And the other thing that, is worth thinking through as a farmer, particularly as insects become a thing, is that if you're an abattoir or McDonald's or a processor of beef, you're going to be thinking, well, what's the easiest way for me to move the margin of carbon in my supply chain? And it might be that we let the farmers do what they've always done and we buy Brazilian hydropower or Indonesian rainforest credits for, a couple of dollars per ton of carbon dioxide. And maybe you're thinking, well, let's establish the average for beef farmers, and everybody who does better, we can reward, and anybody who does worse, we can penalize. And then we've got a straight line towards our in-setting goals. And that's what commodity-specific sustainability reporting will look like. And to reduce the cost burden of that, they're probably going to estimate using remote sensing and hardly involving the farmer at all. The alternative, and we should be grateful for things like the Science-Based Targets Initiative that has said to supply chains, we don't think you'll get traceability initially from the single cow all the way to the barcoded product in Coles or Woolies. So we're going to let you report on a supply shed or a landscape basis rather than at a per cow basis. And so that is actually giving rise to a counter argument, which could be helpful for farmers, which could enable us to say, well, if you're looking at the supply shed, which is looking at the landscape, well, then we could actually tell you what are the things as farmers in this landscape that make economic and environmental sense. Now, economic sense, it's gross margin, it's marginal reaction, it's dollars in your pocket. Our accountants, our advisors, we sort of understand that. But environmental benefit looks very different in different landscapes, depending on the rainfall, depending on the soil, depending on the topography. Sometimes the best thing to do is to plant a tree, and sometimes the best thing to do is to take a tree out. In some riparian zones, it's better to put the trees inside the fence near the bank. And in other riparian zones, which were never creeks, they were chains of ponds, you actually want to create, leaky weirs and things, slowing the water down, not increasing the depth of creek. And you actually want to put the vegetation outside of the fence. So there's no hard and fast rule that one environmental intervention will work across all landscapes. But if you have commodity-specific sustainability reporting, as opposed to landscape-specific regeneration, you're going to encounter lots of perverse outcomes that come from measuring the averages, dictating interventions, looking at shit from space instead of asking farmers what works for them. Our last little bit on this section, and then I promise I'll let you go to questions, is like in a world where so many claims are being made, and in a world where so many carbon developers did dodgy stuff, and I'm not just talking about Australian developers with respect to HIR, I'm talking about Zimbabwean carbon credit schemes that overestimated the amount of sequestration by anywhere from 5 to 50 times and sold that to the biggest companies on earth, who've then got egg on their face. And, you know, there's greenwashing and there's green hushing and all of that paranoia about actually buying emissions that are bullshit has led to the creation of the United Nations Transparency Protocol. And what that enables is a protocol works differently to a technical solution. A technical solution would be something like we all use one blockchain and then everybody can see everything that they need to see in order to de-risk greenwashing. But the chances of getting consensus on one blockchain when you're dealing with multinational markets and multiple different corporations, etc., is silly. So instead of using a technical solution, you use a protocol solution. And protocols are what makes the internet work. If you're sending an email from Google, it can arrive at an Outlook inbox because it uses TCP, which is the email protocol. If you open a browser on Chrome or Edge or Bing or whatever, you can still see a website because websites use HTTP, which is a hypertext markup protocol. And when it comes to claims, the UN is saying, if you're making a claim about a product, you have to put it in a protocol so that anybody who has received that email equivalent or opened up that web page equivalent can see how that claim was constructed. And so that's going to radically improve transparency, not just for individual farmers, but for collectives of farmers, for commodities, for the commodity supply chains against, or, you know, competing with one another, for countries competing against one another. And it's pretty exciting. Now, I promise I'll finish with the carbon and we'll start to talk biodiversity now. For a long time, biodiversity, you know, relied on either farmers' love of the bush or on untitled regulated, untitled meaning, you know, they would be attached to the property's title register in that state, and they were regulated offsets. So in order to be generated, somebody had to cut down a tree, a hectare of that habitat, and then if they did, they were regulated that they had to protect another hectare of equivalent habitat in perpetuity. And so that led to a big gap between the love of bush and what you could get done with a land care grant and regulated offsets. And so what we've found is that over the last 4 years, that's become much better. You're seeing there's now a spectrum from love of the bush, which taps into the personal motivation of farmers, to grants which enable the public good of, you know, protecting and restoring and enhancing habitat, to now you're starting to see those supply chains who've got to grips with carbon or are coming to grips with carbon, also starting to look at their impact on biodiversity and being able to say, well, there's certification, bronze, silver, gold that we need in order to tell what story the farmers can about the protection of biodiversity. And then there's nature positive N+ credits. So this refers to, you know, improving the extent or the condition of newly created habitat. It's not necessarily held on title and a regulated offset, but it should be rewarded. And then carbon plus biodiversity has certainly improved. And even the regulated schemes, so I'm talking specifically about New South Wales and the ACT, the Biodiversity Conservation Trust has gone from regulated offsets to BSA, biodiversity stewardship agreements, other schemes and tenders. And so there's a range of things, including funding carbon planting projects that at their conclusion in 25 years will revert to a biodiversity stewardship agreement, which has two positive effects for farmers. It takes away the upfront costs of planting trees or drastically reduces them. And then after the 25-year life of a carbon project, continues to pay the farmer to maintain weed control and feral animal control and, you know, do spot spraying and undertake the measures to continue to maintain or improve that biodiversity. And so biodiversity has become a lot better in the last 4 years. So I'm going to stop there for now. I've talked at you for, 45 minutes straight, and I appreciate your patience. So at this point, we'll take a halftime break, and just looking at markets and what we've talked about so far, offsets, insets, biodiversity markets. Are there any questions from the floor?
Just jump in if you do. We don't have any in the chat. We're all very holding steadfast with everyone still online. But Dave, did you want to jump in there and ask a question?
Yeah, good on you. Thanks, Jenna, and thanks, Wardy. Great presentation. You're very passionate and got so much information that just flows out there. Really, really interested to hear. I'm just sort of struggling a bit with how we can best communicate all of that sort of information to understand the environment that we're operating in to, farmers and individual business owners that are, confronted with the whole lot. One of your first comments was there's so much jargon in there, and there absolutely is, and there's no way of getting around it. But I just wonder if you've got any thoughts about how you can take what's effectively your knowledge, this kind of a presentation, in something that can be more widely available for individuals out there that are looking to get into environmental markets.
Dave, hopefully the next sort of half of this we'll talk to, if this half is about the problems and the context, maybe the next half is more aimed at, well, what can I as an individual farmer do about this to put myself in a position? And the short answer is, on our own, I think we get skinned. Individually, we're too small to make a material impact in environment, and we're too economically unimportant on our own. But collectively, in our region, in our landscape, we are absolutely the ones that will determine with our interventions how biodiversity, how hydrology, how even the intensity of the commodities that are drawn from our region, how they actually get into the market. So remembering that we hold all the aces, and that ultimately, if people are serious about making an impact on climate and environment, they have to come to farmers and they have to work with farmers in order to achieve those outcomes. So I'll talk more to that, Dave. But I think on our own, we're not in a strong position.
Yeah, together is the way to go. All right, I'll look forward to the second part of your talk. Thanks, Wardy.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. We do have one question here, Wardy, and it's if I grow low carbon land because of my practice, who is responsible to create a market for it? The MLA, the shops, me?
It's a really great question. So because 80 to 90% of our protein ends up exported, only 20% of it stays in Australia, and of that, most of it goes to Coles and Woolies. a bit goes to butchers and even less goes direct to the consumer. But those that are going direct to the consumer are saying already they're taking the responsibility of creating a brand and telling their story. So it is possible for you as an individual or you as a collective of growers in a region to create your own brand. But we're seeing it in the supply chain where we're seeing Greenham's, which is an abattoir, operates in southern New South Wales, northern Victoria primarily. And they have a brand that they get a premium for. And any of the farmers that pull cattle into that supply chain that reach what they call the tier 2, they're getting a $2.50 per kilogram premium. And that premium is reflected in the price that the branded product on the supermarket shelf gets above the non-branded product. So an individual or a group or a processor can create a brand. And then you've got people like Australia and the MLA, who, if they're not, should be really thinking about, well, our beef is far less deforested than Brazilian beef. And so we should be positioning Australia's beef exports as clean and green. When it comes to trade, Australia needs to think, well, you know, if Europe holds firm on wanting climate and environment and animal welfare and deforestation credentials to food that hits their supermarket shelves, and the US has just kind of thrown all of the toys out of the cot and said, well, we're not going to regulate farmers at all, then Australia has a trade choice. Someone like Sue McCluskey needs to be thinking, well, what's the best for Australian farmers? Should we get rid of our climate and environment reporting, which puts us on an even footing with the US producers? We're not held back any worse or better than they are, and then we can compete for the markets without any hindrance. Or do they say, well, actually, the US is now, through its decisions to not report on climate and environment, restricting its own access to Europe and Asia. And that's a big opportunity for Australia, who, if we decide to continue to report on these things in the way the ASRS is laid out, we could actually pick up market share from the American producers because they're not compliant with the market access requirements. So, long way to answer the question about who's responsible for the brand, but it's kind of all of us collectively. And you can bring that power closer to home, all the way to your decision as to whether you sell your wool, lamb, beef, leather directly, or whether you are selling into commodity supply chains, in which case your influence then becomes about being a member of the MLA, about being a levy payer, or about what sort of influence you can collectively bring to bear.
Brilliant. All right. Well, I just let you know, Wardy, that we've really only got 10 minutes left. So it's possible that we will go over time, everybody, and apologies for that. But if you want to stay online and hang in there, it would be fantastic. But if you do have to go, we'll record it and you'll get the recording anyway. So yeah.
And we've got two more webinars. We've got two more webinars. So.
That's right, exactly. Yeah. So yeah. Back to you, Wardy.
All right, thank you. I will try and do the solution quicker than I've been going. So, as I was saying, Dave, safety in numbers. What we've found in the last 4 years ago, Regen Farmers Mutual started, and then since then, we've worked with 11 landscapes to create an idea around, well, what does environmental markets look like if farmers are the center of the universe, and landscape scale rather than farm scale is what we focus on. Well, we do know that, you know, biodiversity corridors work at landscape scale. Rehydration of catchments works at landscape scale, not just farm scale. And if we care about biodiversity and flooding and drought resilience, you know, we have to work at a scale that's typically multi-farmer. And we see that by coordinating single farms, you can create synergies that no individual farm can create on their own, and that you can create even greater quality outcomes that are cheaper and more reliable and will fare better in a United Nations transparency protocol kind of way by having more farmers involved. You actually reduce the risk of bad actors being involved and doing things that create greenwash. And working at landscape scale isn't that difficult. Ultimately, a landscape impact program arrives at this point where you end up with land management units within each landscape. And then within those land management units, there's certain interventions you can do. And I mean, sometimes you think of farming as being a vastly creative industry where you can do a whole bunch of things, but really you can light a match, you can plant a tree, you can pull down a tree, you can put up a fence, you can do biological control with a rifle or Roundup or whatever. But there aren't 100 things that you can do. And you're looking at what are the income potential of those things and when they will kick in terms of how long they take to gestate before they yield and how long it's expected to take before a mechanism exists to reward farmers, etc. And we've seen those case studies, particularly in the box gum grassy woodlands, which is out of the 7 of the first landscape impact programs we did, 5 of them ended up having this box gum grassy woodlands ecosystem. And to cut it, you know, super fine, a landscape plan isn't really that difficult. You need to ask the farmers clearly, what are your land management units? What are the interventions and priorities? And what are the strategies that see those interventions, you know, implemented? And you need to do that, recognizing that farmers are 50% of the land mass, but of the private landholders that aren't farmers, particularly on the eastern fall of the Great Dividing Range, where we've got that urban depopulation subject to flooding, you know, used to be prime agricultural land. It's now mostly mansions, but those private landholders and farmers and public landholders, whether they're local government, state government, national, like Crown lands and national parks, and of course the traditional owners, they'll all have similar land management units. They might have different priorities or interventions, like traditional owners might be more inclined to use a match than farmers who might be inclined to use grazing. Both can reduce fuel loads, for example. And strategies and opportunities to reward, well, you might find that the rewards actually for traditional owners might come from public good, whereas the rewards for farmers might come from supply chains. And I guess that talks to, you know, environmental markets and demystifying them was the purpose of this webinar. But really environmental markets, their carbon, their biodiversity, which is emerging, and hydrology you expect will be there in a couple of years. But they're not the only game in town. Supply chains are going to be compelled because of supply chain reporting requirements to contribute towards sequestration and harm minimization and pollution reduction. And, you know, I imagine that governments of all stripes and all colours and philanthropy are still going to push, you know, public good outcomes. And we're very buoyed by things like local procurement of food and fibre, particularly with things like the Brisbane Olympics and, or the Australian Olympics held in Brisbane, and value chain coordination. and the idea that we just don't have enough land for renewable energy and conservation and farming to all meet their goals. There's going to be multiple land use and local economy opportunities. And so if we increase the pools of capital to reward farmers at landscape scale, we'll get more capital in that's more suited to the outcomes that each of them are looking for. And as mentioned, we've done this several times, and it's really encouraging to see groups of farmers come together. In the Western Murray, badly affected by water market reform, they do have this amazing mid-river delta. So the Murray Inland Delta, with all of its birds, with all of its built and natural water infrastructure, lends itself to hydrated biolinks. The Southern Tablelands Agricultural Restoration Project, where a planting design enables them to create a carbon crop that after 2 years, but it's also recreating box gum grassy woodlands, and the design of 2 close rows, a gap, 2 close rows, a gap, 2 close rows, enables after 5 years, when you've produced the trees aren't going to then be eaten. When you've produced a carbon, when you've produced an open woodland, you've also got usually better, improved native pastures that can still be in production. And, you know, the trap rock and headwater custodians, and there are so many great examples that our farmers have already put together over time. Oh, they're all going to want to play. That's annoying, isn't it? Give me a second. They'd turn them all off and go, yeah. So my predictions as to what we can do as farmers, that we'll hear so much about ASRS in the lead up to this next election. One of the groups is pro-nuclear, which means that they might look at getting rid of the clean energy regulator, which gets rid of the current carbon market. That could be interesting, especially if what's put in place is better than the clean energy regulator, which isn't a hard job. They're pretty shit. The other one, though, is if that team that wants nuclear gets in, they've already said they're going to push Scope 3 reporting from 2026 to 2029, which is outside of the next elections cycle. So they're really saying we're pushing it off to forever. Trade, how Australia orients itself compared to, say, beef farmers in America, is going to be really interesting. And how much Australian politicians echo Trump versus echoing Europe, it's all going to be impacts over the next 4 years, so that when we do this in 2028, 2029, these are the things that I think will change. And I think the way for farmers to get into this is through creating a landscape action plan, which gives rise to a supply shed agreement, which talks to how each of these pools of capital can engage each of these land managers to take the interventions that make sense and create those outcomes that, you know, reward each of those pools of capital. And to do it in a region requires, I think, 3 roles: a custodian of the action plan, a developer of the supply shed agreement, holder of that, and a regen advisor that can, you know, help farmers go through the process. And they need tools, the ability to co-design and work together, a landscape story that tells people internally and externally what are the assets we've got here and what are the ways that we can work as landholders to grow those assets, and reflecting that, because it's hard for someone to buy a koala and put it on their desk in Collins Street or George Street. They're not buying the actual koala. They're buying the data that says the koala is in the tree and the tree's in the paddock and that tree is still standing. And that's why you need digital infrastructure. And so, you know, where do you start? You start by getting a twin, knowing your carbon emissions number, finding your crowd in your local community, in your landscape, and using the safety that comes from coming in numbers. And that is it. Jenny Lee, Mary, hopefully if we have time in the next webinar, we can explore more of the solutions. But I didn't also want to, be one big advertisement for the things that we believe. I want to give us time to ask questions. Yeah, Dave, happy to share the presentation. It's basically in the public domain because of this recording, but also happy to share the PowerPoint.
Brilliant. Awesome. Thanks, Wardy. Yeah, if anyone did want to just